The ballroom of the Grand Arch Hotel was a sea of polite laughter and clinking champagne glasses, but for Daisy Miller, it felt like drowning. She tugged at the hem of her simple, borrowed dress, a lone rowboat in an ocean of glittering yachts. This was her college's annual alumni gala, an event she'd only attended because her scholarship required her to volunteer. Now standing awkwardly by a towering ice sculpture of a swan, she felt less like a volunteer and more like a ghost haunting a party she could never truly belong to. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anxiety. She scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar, friendly face, but found none. And then she saw him. It was Mark, her ex-boyfriend, gliding through the crowd with the predatory grace of a shark. On his arm was his new girlfriend, a girl who looked like she was born wearing diamonds. Mark's smile was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at her. He'd seen her. He was coming over. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She couldn't let him see her like this. Alone, insignificant, a charity case in a room full of wealth. She couldn't bear the smug, pitying look he would give her, the one that said, "See, you were nothing without me." Her survival instincts screamed. She had to do something, anything. Her desperate eyes darted around the room, and then they landed on him. He was standing near a marble pillar, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that probably cost more than her entire semester's tuition. He held a drink in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just watching the crowd with an air of profound, magnificent boredom, a king observing the tiresome antics of his court. He looked just as trapped as she felt. It was a reckless, insane, split-second decision born of pure desperation. Without allowing herself a moment to think, Daisy marched toward him. The space between them closed with every frantic beat of her heart. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes registering a flicker of surprise. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She reached him, grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit with trembling hands, rose onto her toes, and pressed her lips against his. It wasn't a romantic kiss. It was a collision. It was frantic and clumsy, tasting of panic and the faint mint from her breath. It was a shield, a desperate act of self-preservation meant to scream a single defiant message to the man watching from across the room. I am not alone. I am not broken. I have moved on. The kiss lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. She pulled back, her face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with pure, unadulterated mortification. The stranger's eyes, a deep, startling shade of gray, were wide with shock. His lips were parted. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and something clean, like fresh rain. She had just assaulted a complete stranger. He was going to call security. He was going to cause a scene. Her life was over. "I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice a choked whisper. She took a step back, ready to turn and flee, to disappear into the night, and never show her face again. But the stranger didn't look angry. He didn't look disgusted. As the shock in his eyes faded, it was replaced by something else, something unreadable. He blinked once, slowly, as if rebooting. Then, for the first time that night, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a sunrise breaking through the cool mask of indifference he had worn just moments before. It transformed him, lighting up his features with a startling warmth. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low, calm rumble that cut through the noise of the party and wrapped around her like a blanket. "Are you okay?" he asked. Daisy could only stare, her mind a blank slate. He glanced over her shoulder, his smile turning into a knowing, almost conspiratorial grin. "Because as far as I'm concerned," he murmured, his gaze returning to hers, "we're fine." Daisy's mind stalled. The words "we're fine" echoed in the sudden ringing silence of her head, completely short-circuiting the frantic apology she was trying to form. She stared at the stranger, at Gabriel, as she would soon learn, and felt a dizzying sense of dislocation. He wasn't supposed to smile. He wasn't supposed to be fine. He was supposed to be furious, giving her the opening she needed to flee in shame. Instead, he stood there, a bastion of calm in her personal hurricane, that small, knowing smile still playing on his lips. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mark stop in his tracks, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. He glared for a moment, then turned abruptly and steered his girlfriend away. The threat had passed. The storm had been diverted. The adrenaline that had propelled her forward crashed, leaving her weak-kneed and utterly mortified. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just needed to. I saw my ex and I just... Escape a ghost?" He finished for her, his perception so unnervingly accurate it stole her breath. His gaze was not judgmental, but kind, holding a depth that made her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and deeply comforting. "Something like that," she admitted, her cheeks still burning. "Well," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor, "for what it's worth, your ghost looked thoroughly vanquished." He gestured toward the hotel's lobby bar, a quieter, more intimate space away from the ballroom's glare. "Let me buy you a coffee. A thank you for providing the first interesting moment of my entire evening." The offer was so unexpected, so disarmingly gentle, that she found herself nodding before she could invent an excuse. The conversation that followed was a surreal departure from the chaos of the last 10 minutes. It flowed with an ease that felt impossible. He asked her nothing about the kiss, nothing about her ex. Instead, he asked her about the book she was carrying in her oversized tote bag, a worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude. That single question unlocked something in her. They talked about magical realism, about the frayed edges of old paperbacks, about the way a story can be a home. Without realizing it, swept up in the intensity of his focus, Daisy found herself confessing her deepest, most cherished dream. To one day own a small, cozy cafe bookstore, a place where people could get lost in stories, with the scent of old books and fresh coffee in the air. She expected the usual reaction, a polite nod, a condescending smile, the kind of reaction that rich people in expensive suits gave to the quaint dreams of scholarship students. But Gabriel didn't do that. He leaned forward, his gray eyes alight with a genuine, startling interest. He listened. He truly listened, as if her dream was not a flight of fancy, but a concrete, fascinating business plan. When she finally trailed off, embarrassed by her own passionate rambling, he was silent for a moment. "A place for stories," he said softly, more to himself than to her. He reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a phone to ask for her number, he took out a pen and scribbled on a cocktail napkin. "I know a place," he said, his voice dropping into that same conspiratorial tone from before. "The coffee is terrible, truly awful, but it has the best collection of first editions you will ever see." He pushed the napkin across the table. It was an address for an old, dusty-looking bookshop on the other side of town. "Meet me there tomorrow. 3 o'clock. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation that felt like a challenge. Daisy stared at the napkin, her heart doing a slow, complicated flip in her chest. This was insane. She knew nothing about this man, not his last name, not what he did, nothing except that he had kind eyes and a smile that could melt glaciers. Going would be reckless. It would be crazy. But the memory of their conversation, the feeling of being truly heard, was a pull stronger than logic. The curiosity was a spark that had already started a fire. Would she risk it? Looking into his steady, expectant eyes, she realized she already knew the answer. The next day, Daisy stood across the street from the address on the napkin. The Book Nook was a faded dream of a storefront, nestled between a laundromat and a pizza place. Its windows were cluttered with sun-bleached paperbacks and towers of books that seemed to defy gravity. It was dusty, chaotic, and utterly perfect. It was a place from her own heart. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the street, the little bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle. And there he was. He was standing in an aisle dedicated to poetry, and for a moment she barely recognized him. The impeccable suit was gone, replaced by a simple gray Henley and dark jeans. The expensive watch was still on his wrist, a subtle tell, but his entire demeanor had shifted. He no longer looked like a king in a ballroom. He looked like a literature professor on his day off, completely at home among the towering shelves. The contrast was jarring, and strangely, it made him even more intimidating. He looked up as she entered, and that slow, warm smile returned. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come," he said. "I was starting to think this place wasn't real," she countered, her voice a little breathless. For the next few hours, he let her lead him through her world. He was a quiet, attentive shadow, as she navigated the labyrinthine aisles of the book nook, her fingers dancing over the spines of forgotten treasures. He listened as she explained the difference between a first edition and a first printing, his gaze fixed on her with that same unnerving intensity from the night before. Afterward, she took him to her favorite cafe, a tiny, no-frills spot where the coffee was 50 cents cheaper than anywhere else, and the owner knew her by name. They sat on mismatched chairs, and he didn't flinch at the chipped mug he was given. He seemed utterly fascinated by the simple, unpretentious rhythm of her life, a world away from the calculated elegance of the Grand Arch Hotel. He never once talked about his job, only offering a vague, mysterious smile when she asked. "I invest in stories," was all he said. They ended the afternoon on a worn wooden bench in a small local park, reading their newly purchased books in a comfortable silence. The sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in a long time, the frantic, anxious drumbeat in Daisy's chest had quieted to a soft, steady rhythm. It was easy. It was natural. It was terrifying. The peace was shattered by a familiar, condescending voice. "Well, well, look what we have here. Slumming it, are we, Daisy?" Daisy's head snapped up. Mark stood before them, his arms crossed, a smug sneer plastered on his face. He must have seen them from the street. It was too much of a coincidence. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, her voice tight. His eyes flickered dismissively over Gabriel. "Seriously? This is your big upgrade? You traded me for a librarian?" He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I guess you can't afford my world anymore." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Daisy felt the familiar flush of shame, the sting of humiliation. She opened her mouth to retort, to say something, anything. But before she could utter a single word, Gabriel closed his book with a soft, definitive thump. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rose to his feet, a calm, immovable object. He was taller than Mark, broader, and he seemed to take up all the air around them. He looked directly at Mark, his gray eyes now cold and hard as steel. "I think," Gabriel said, his voice a low, quiet command that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "that your conversation here is over." There was no threat in his words, but the absolute authority in his tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man who was not used to being questioned, a man who expected to be obeyed. Mark, for all his arrogance, recognized it instantly. He flinched as if he'd been struck. He took an involuntary step back, his sneer dissolving into a look of pure shock. Without another word, Mark turned and walked away, his retreat hasty and undignified. Daisy stared at Gabriel, who was now calmly brushing a piece of lint off his sleeve as if nothing had happened. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from awe. She had just seen a glimpse of the power he kept so carefully hidden beneath his quiet exterior, and she realized, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that there was so much more to this man than a love for old books. The silence that followed Mark's hasty retreat was thick with unspoken questions. Gabriel sat back down on the bench, as if he hadn't just dismantled a man with 5 quiet words. He picked up his book, his thumb marking the page he'd left off. Daisy's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you." He finally looked at her, the steel in his eyes softening back into that familiar, gentle gray. "There's nothing to thank me for." "No, really," she insisted, her gaze earnest. "No one's ever stood up for me like that before." The admission felt deeply personal, a confession of a lifetime of feeling small and undefended. The moment hung between them, a new, fragile thread of intimacy weaving itself into the tapestry of their strange connection. In the days that followed, that single thread multiplied. Their meetings became a regular, unspoken routine. The line between a series of curious encounters and something more blurred, and then vanished completely. He helped her assemble a cheap, flat-pack bookshelf in her tiny apartment, the two of them laughing as they struggled with the confusing instructions. She, in turn, made him laugh, a real deep, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. He fit into her world with a seamlessness that was baffling. He never complained about her cramped living space or the fact that her idea of a fancy dinner was ordering from the good pizza place. He seemed to be shedding a skin, the cool, detached billionaire from the gala disappearing to reveal someone warmer, more real. He felt, he told her once, like he was finally breathing after holding his breath for a very long time. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night. They were in her small kitchen, attempting to cook spaghetti bolognese from a recipe she'd found online. Flour dusted their clothes, and the air was warm with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. It was domestic. It was simple. It was perfect. "So," she began, stirring the sauce, her tone deliberately casual. "You invest in stories. You defend me from my exes. You know the difference between a first and second printing. But I still don't know anything real about you. What about your family?" The shift in him was instantaneous. His smile tightened. His shoulders, which had been relaxed and easy, grew rigid. He turned away from her, focusing on chopping onions with a sudden, fierce precision. "There's not much to tell," he said, his voice flat. "Gabriel," she pressed gently, sensing a deep well of pain behind his evasion. He stopped chopping. The knife clattered against the cutting board. He braced his hands on the counter, his back still to her. "My parents passed away a few years ago," he said, his voice low and strained. "The family business. It all fell to me. I've been running it alone ever since." He finally turned to face her, and the carefully constructed armor he wore was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that made her heart clench. The powerful man who exuded control was gone, replaced by a man who looked profoundly, deeply alone. "It's a big empty world, Daisy," he confessed, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer hide. "My world, full of boardrooms and contracts and people who want something from me." He took a step closer, his gray eyes searching hers, pleading for her to understand. "Being with you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Here, in your world. It's the first time in years that I haven't felt completely alone." The air crackled, thick with the weight of his confession. He closed the small space between them, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. He leaned in, and this time, there was no desperation, no pretense, no audience. This time, the kiss was real. It was soft and questioning at first, then deepened as she responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. It was a kiss of shared loneliness, of finding an unexpected sanctuary in another person. It was everything. But as he held her, a cold, familiar weight settled in his gut. The weight of the secret he was still keeping. He was Gabriel Montague, CEO of a global empire, and this wonderful, genuine, unsuspecting woman who made him feel whole had no idea. The lie, which had started as a shield, was quickly becoming a poison. The kiss changed everything. The unspoken question of, "What are we?" was answered without a single word. They were falling for each other fast and irrevocably. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments, shared coffees before her classes, late-night talks in her tiny apartment, the comfortable silence of reading side by side. For a brief, blissful period, their two separate worlds merged into one. But the real world, Gabriel's world, was waiting. "I have a work dinner I can't get out of," he told her one afternoon, his tone apologetic. "A fundraising gala for the city library. I know it's not your scene, but I'd really like it if you came with me." Daisy's heart sank. A gala. Another ballroom full of people in expensive clothes where she would feel like an imposter. But then she saw the look in his eyes. A quiet plea. He didn't want to go back to his world alone. "Okay," she agreed, her voice more confident than she felt. "I'll go." The night of the event, a sleek black car, the kind that usually only appeared in movies, arrived to pick her up. Gabriel was already inside, looking breathtakingly handsome in a dark tuxedo that made him look every bit the king she'd first imagined him to be. He smiled as she got in, but there was a tension in his jaw she hadn't seen since that first night at the hotel. He was putting his armor back on. The restaurant was a cathedral of modern wealth, all glass and chrome and hushed, reverent whispers. Daisy clutched her small handbag, feeling the familiar anxiety creep back in. Gabriel's hand found hers under the table, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a small, reassuring gesture. The evening was a performance. Gabriel was charming, attentive, and utterly brilliant, navigating conversations with powerful-looking people with an effortless grace. Daisy just tried to keep up, smiling and nodding at the appropriate times. Then, a man with a familiar face, a world-famous novelist whose picture was on the back of half the books in her apartment, approached their table. "Gabriel," the author said, his voice booming with familiarity. "A pleasure to see you. We must discuss the launch of my next book. The marketing plan is brilliant." Gabriel smiled politely, his grip on Daisy's hand tightening almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Arthur. My team will be in touch." Daisy stared, completely bewildered. "You know him?" she whispered, after the author had walked away. "He's one of the stories I invest in," Gabriel replied smoothly, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. The answer felt slick, evasive. Later, as they were leaving the restaurant, a sudden blinding flash of light erupted from their right. A man with a camera was snapping pictures furiously. "Mr. Montague? Mr. Montague, who's the new girl?" Gabriel's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He shielded Daisy with his body, his arm wrapping around her protectively as he hustled her toward the waiting car. He barked something at the driver and the car sped away from the curb, leaving the photographer behind. The silence in the car was heavy and suffocating. The easy intimacy they shared in her small apartment felt a million miles away. "What was that?" Daisy finally asked, her voice small. The flash of the camera was still imprinted on the back of her eyelids. "Nothing," Gabriel said, his voice tight, his gaze fixed on the blur of city lights outside the window. "Just an inconvenient photographer." But Daisy knew it was more than that. It was a lie. He was hiding something big. And for the first time, a cold, sharp sliver of doubt pierced the warm bubble of their romance. It was the first seed of a suspicion that would soon grow into a thorny, painful vine. The next morning, the world felt tilted on its axis. The memory of the camera flash, of the cold, hard mask that had fallen over Gabriel's face, had kept Daisy awake most of the night. She tried to brush it off, to tell herself she was overreacting, but the feeling of unease clung to her like a damp fog. Her phone buzzed, shattering the quiet of her apartment. It was her best friend, Chloe, her voice a high-pitched squeal of pure, unadulterated shock. "Daisy! Oh my God, you have to go to a newsstand right now. No, wait, don't move. I'm sending you a picture. You are not going to believe this." Before Daisy could even ask what she was talking about, a notification popped up on her screen. It was an image file from Chloe. With a trembling finger, she opened it. It was the photo, the one from last night. A picture of her and Gabriel, caught in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the camera flash as he hurried her into the car. But it wasn't the photo that made the air leave her lungs in a single, painful rush. It was the headline printed in bold, sensational letters above it. Reclusive billionaire Gabriel Montague finally steps out with mystery woman. Gabriel. Montague. The name echoed in her head, a deafening gong. She scanned the article, her eyes flying over the words, her heart pounding a frantic, sick rhythm against her ribs. CEO of Montague Publishing. One of the largest and most influential publishing houses in the world, inherited the empire after the tragic death of his parents. Net worth estimated in the billions. Notoriously private. And then came the final, soul-crushing blow. Montague Publishing is also the parent company of the global coffeehouse chain, The Daily Grind, a brand synonymous with literary culture. The floor didn't just drop out from under her, the entire universe collapsed. It wasn't the money. It was the lie. The sheer, staggering scale of it. The man who had listened with such intensity as she described her dream of a small cafe bookstore was, in fact, the king of a global cafe bookstore empire. The man who had seemed so fascinated by her simple world was the master of a universe she could only ever dream of entering. The man who claimed to feel alone was one of the most powerful figures in the literary world. Every shared moment, every quiet conversation, every seemingly genuine smile was now tainted, recast in the harsh, cruel light of this new reality. She felt like a fool, a naive, pathetic little project for a bored billionaire. Had he been laughing at her this whole time? Was she just an amusing diversion, a story he was investing in for his own entertainment? Her phone rang again. The screen lit up with his name. Gabriel. She stared at it, a white-hot rage mixing with a grief so profound it felt like a physical wound. She answered, her hand shaking. Daisy, he began, his voice rushed and full of a panic she now recognized as guilt. Daisy, listen to me, I can explain. I was going to tell you. No, she interrupted, her voice dangerously calm, colder than any tone he had ever used. You can't. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with his desperation. Our meeting tonight is cancelled, she continued, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. In fact, I think everything between us is. And with a final, decisive click, she ended the call, severing the connection. She sank onto her sofa, the glossy magazine photo mocking her from her phone screen, leaving him on the other side of the city with nothing but a dial tone and the shattering realization that he had just lost the only real thing in his life. The silence in Daisy's apartment was a living thing, a suffocating presence that pressed in on her from all sides. For an hour, she did nothing but stare at the wall, her mind a maelstrom of hurt, anger, and a grief so sharp it felt like a betrayal from her own heart. Every text message that buzzed on her phone, each one a desperate plea from him, was another twist of the knife. Then, a hard, insistent knock echoed from her front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of someone who would not be ignored. Her heart leapt into her throat. She knew who it was. She didn't move, praying he would just go away. Daisy! His voice came through the thin wood of the door, strained and urgent. Daisy, please, don't do this, just talk to me. She squeezed her eyes shut. Go away, Gabriel. No, he said, his voice closer now, right up against the door. You are not getting rid of me this easily. Something in his tone, the raw, desperate refusal to be dismissed, cracked her resolve. With a shaky breath, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. He stood there, looking utterly wrecked. His hair was a mess, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. The cool, collected billionaire was gone, replaced by a man standing on the edge of a precipice. He was still in his work clothes, but his tie was loosened, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, pleading energy. She stepped back, letting him into the small space. The apartment, which had always felt like her sanctuary, suddenly felt claustrophobic with him in it. He closed the door behind him, and they stood there, 2 feet apart, an ocean of lies between them. "Why?" she asked, the single word raw and wounded. "Why did you lie to me?" "I didn't lie," he shot back, his desperation making him defensive. I omitted. It's not the same thing." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Not the same? You let me ramble on about my pathetic little dream of a cafe bookstore, all while knowing you owned a global empire of them. How is that not a lie, Gabriel?" "Because I had to know," he said, his voice rising, his hands gesturing wildly. "I had to be sure that you liked me, Gabriel, the man in the dusty bookshop, the man who can't cook spaghetti, not Gabriel Montague, the CEO, not the money." The accusation hit her like a slap. The hurt that had been simmering in her chest erupted into a white-hot flame of indignation. All this time, she had been worried about not being good enough for his world, when the real problem was that he had never thought she was good enough for him. "You thought I was what? A gold digger?" she retorted, her voice shaking with a fury that surprised them both. "You, with all your power and your supposed intelligence, you looked at me, and that's what you saw." She took a step toward him, invading his space, her eyes blazing. The power dynamic between them had inverted completely. She was no longer the timid girl. She was the one with the moral high ground, and he was the one crumbling. "The problem was never your money, Gabriel," she said, her voice dropping, each word precise and devastating. "It was your lack of faith. You didn't trust me. From the very first moment you were testing me. And in your desperate attempt to protect yourself, you insulted me more deeply than you could ever imagine." The truth of her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The defensiveness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He saw it then. He saw the flaw in his own logic, the profound arrogance of his fear. He had been so focused on the risk she posed to him that he never considered the damage he was doing to her. His shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of regret. "Forgive me, Daisy," he whispered, his voice cracking, the sound barely audible in the tense silence of the room. "I messed up. I know." "Yes," she replied, the anger draining away, leaving only a vast, empty ache. Tears she hadn't even realized were forming began to spill down her cheeks. "You did." She looked at the man she had fallen in love with, now a stranger, tainted by deceit. "And I don't know," she said, her voice breaking, "if this is something we can fix." She wrapped her arms around herself, a desperate attempt to hold her own shattered pieces together. "I think you should go." In the days that followed, Gabriel's desperation took on a tangible form. It began with flowers. Not a simple bouquet, but a veritable forest of rare, exotic orchids that filled the entire hallway outside Daisy's apartment. A breathtakingly beautiful and breathtakingly expensive apology. She had the delivery man take them to a local hospital. Next came the books. A first-edition leather-bound copy of The Great Gatsby, her favorite novel. It arrived by special courier in a velvet-lined box. It was a collector's item, worth thousands. She sent it back without a note. He didn't understand. He was trying to speak the only language of apology he knew, the language of grand, overwhelming gestures. But Daisy didn't want gestures. She wanted sincerity. She wanted space. The more he pushed, the more he proved her point, that he saw the world, and her, through a lens of wealth and power. To escape the siege and the suffocating emptiness of her apartment, Daisy threw herself into a project at the elementary school where she taught. The school was hosting its annual book fair, a small, cheerful event to raise money for the library. She volunteered to coordinate it, finding a purpose in the simple, satisfying work of sorting donated paperbacks and creating colorful displays with her students. She found an unexpected ally in David, a fellow teacher. He was kind, funny, and down to earth, with a warm smile and an easy laugh. He clearly had a crush on her, but he was respectful, never pushing, just offering a helping hand and a steady, uncomplicated friendship that was a balm to her bruised heart. On the day of the book fair, the school gymnasium was buzzing with the happy chaos of children and parents. Daisy was standing with David by a table of picture books, laughing at a joke he'd just made, when a sudden hush fell over the corner of the room. A shadow fell over them. It was Gabriel. He stood there in another one of his perfect suits, looking as out of place in the cheerful, low-budget gymnasium as a panther in a petting zoo. His eyes, however, were not on Daisy. They were fixed on David, a cold, possessive fire blazing in their gray depths. He took in the sight of them laughing together, the easy camaraderie, and his jaw tightened into a line of solid granite. It was a raw, primal jealousy, a feeling so potent it seemed to suck the air out of the room. He finally dragged his gaze to Daisy, his expression a carefully controlled mask. But she had already seen it. "Daisy," he said, his voice a low rumble that was meant to sound casual but failed entirely. "I was in the neighborhood. I came to make a donation." David, sensing the sudden, Arctic shift in temperature, gave Daisy a small, questioning look. "I'll, go check on the cash box," he said, making a hasty retreat. Gabriel's eyes followed him until he disappeared into the crowd. Only then did he turn his full, undivided attention back to her. "What are you doing here, Gabriel?" she asked, her arms crossed, her stance defensive. "I told you, a donation," he said, but his gaze flickered back to where David had been standing. The lie was paper thin. He hadn't come to donate. He had come to check on her. A spark of defiance lit in Daisy's eyes. She saw his jealousy for what it was, another form of control, another assumption that he had some claim on her. "Or did you come to mark your territory?" she challenged, her voice quiet but sharp as a shard of glass. The direct hit landed. He flinched, the mask of cool indifference cracking, revealing the raw, insecure man beneath. He had come here to fix things, but in his arrogance and fear, he had only managed to make them infinitely worse. Daisy's challenge hung in the air between them, sharp and glittering as a drawn sword. The cheerful noise of the book fair faded into a distant buzz. Gabriel stood exposed, his flimsy excuse of a donation stripped away, revealing the raw, possessive motive beneath. He could have lied again. He could have doubled down on the pretense, using his wealth and power to intimidate her. The old Gabriel would have. But the man standing in front of her was no longer that man. The past week of her silence had hollowed him out, teaching him a brutal lesson in loss. He let out a slow, ragged breath, the fight visibly draining from his shoulders. "Yes," he admitted, his voice rough with a self-loathing that stunned her into silence. "I saw you with him and I didn't like it. And I hate that I feel this way because I know I have no right to." The raw, unvarnished honesty of his confession disarmed her completely. It was the first truly sincere thing he had said to her since the discovery. He wasn't making excuses or trying to justify his feelings. He was just admitting to them, admitting his own weakness. He took a half-step closer, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I'm done with the grand gestures, Daisy. No more flowers, no more expensive books. I get it now. That's not the way." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his expression shifting from one of pained confession to one of intense, focused resolve. "I'm not going to try and buy you back," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm going to invest in you." Daisy's heart sank. "Gabriel, no, not like that," he interrupted quickly, seeing the disappointment on her face. "Not my money." He looked around the gymnasium, at the colorful handmade signs, at the children clutching their new books. He looked at her, at the passion that lit up her face when she talked about stories. "I'm going to help you build your dream," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The cafe bookstore. I'll finance the entire thing. No strings attached. Consider it an apology. A real one." It was a magnificent offer, It was the keys to the kingdom, the one thing she wanted most in the world, handed to her on a silver platter. It was also a test, and it was one she had to refuse. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm as bedrock. The single word seemed to shock him more than a slap. "I don't want your money, Gabriel," she explained, her gaze unwavering. "I don't want to be another one of your charitable projects or a story you invest in. If I ever build that cafe, I'm going to do it myself, on my own terms." The refusal, the sheer, unexpected force of her integrity, hit him with the power of a physical blow. He stared at her, a whirlwind of emotions crossing his face. Shock, frustration, and then, overriding it all, a profound and overwhelming wave of admiration. He had offered her a shortcut to her dreams, and she had chosen the harder, more honorable path. She didn't want his empire. She wanted his respect. A slow smile, the first genuine one she'd seen in days, touched his lips. He had been playing the game all wrong. "Okay," he said, his voice changing, adapting. He was a brilliant strategist, and he had just been handed the real rules of engagement. "Okay, no money. Not as an investor." He leaned in, his eyes locking with hers, a new, thrilling proposition taking shape. "Then as a partner," he wagered. "A silent partner. I won't give you a dime, but I'll give you my knowledge, my contacts, my time. I'll help you write the business plan. I'll help you navigate the permits. I'll teach you everything I know. Let me prove that I believe in you, not in what my money can do for you." He held his breath, laying his final, most valuable card on the table. Not his wealth, but himself. Daisy stood frozen, caught in a brand new dilemma. Accepting his help meant letting him back into her life, a risk that terrified her. But refusing meant turning her back on the one person who could truly help her achieve her dream, and perhaps the one person who was finally, truly, trying to earn her trust. The decision to say yes was the hardest one Daisy had ever made. It was a tentative, fragile agreement, forged in the noisy chaos of the book fair. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a truce. A willingness to see if the man who had broken her trust was capable of rebuilding it. Their first business meeting took place a few days later at her kitchen table, the same table where he had first confessed his loneliness. The air was thick with a cautious, formal tension. He arrived not in a suit, but in the casual clothes she recognized from their day at the bookshop, a silent acknowledgement that he was entering her world on her terms. He brought a laptop and a stack of notebooks, but no preconceived notions. He didn't tell her what to do. He asked her questions. He made her dig deep, to articulate not just the feeling of her dream, but the practical, logistical bones of it. What was her target demographic? What would her profit margins be on a latte versus a paperback? Who were her suppliers? Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build. Working together was a revelation. It was a new kind of intimacy, one built not on romantic whispers, but on a shared goal and a growing mutual respect. He was a brilliant, incisive teacher, demystifying the intimidating world of business with a patience she never would have expected. He, in turn, watched her with a quiet awe. He saw the fierce intelligence and the passionate, creative spark that drove her. He was seeing the CEO she was always meant to be, and his belief in her was a tangible, steadying force. The ghost of the bored billionaire was fading, replaced by a man who was engaged, passionate, and deeply invested in her success. The first real test of their new dynamic came during a meeting with a potential coffee bean supplier. Mr. Henderson was an older, slick-talking salesman who owned a regional roastery. From the moment they sat down in his office, he directed every single one of his comments to Gabriel. "So, Mr. Montague," Henderson began, leaning back in his leather chair with a smug smile. "Your new little venture, a passion project, is it? What kind of volume are we talking about for your establishment?" Daisy opened her mouth to answer, but Henderson was already sliding a pricing sheet across the table toward Gabriel. "I can give you our top-tier corporate rate, of course. We'll take good care of you." Daisy felt a familiar hot sting of being dismissed, of being rendered invisible. She glanced at Gabriel, a silent challenge in her eyes. "This is it. Show me." Gabriel didn't even look at the pricing sheet. He leaned back in his own chair, mirroring Henderson's posture, and let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he spoke, his voice perfectly calm, yet carrying an edge of pure, unadulterated ice. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his gaze level and unwavering, "I think you should be directing your questions to the CEO of this project." He gestured toward Daisy with a simple, definitive nod. "I'm just the consultant." The shift in the room was seismic. Henderson's smug smile faltered. He stared at Gabriel, then at Daisy, his face flushing with embarrassment as he realized his colossal mistake. He stammered an apology, quickly turning his attention to her, his tone now respectful, almost deferential. Daisy sat up straighter, a quiet surge of power flowing through her. Gabriel had done more than just defend her. He had publicly, unequivocally ceded the power to her. He had used his authority not to overshadow her, but to put the spotlight directly on her. She looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, the wall around her heart didn't just crack. A piece of it crumbled away entirely. In his eyes, she didn't see a billionaire or a liar. She saw a partner. And she saw a respect that was more valuable than all the money in the world. With Gabriel's guidance and Daisy's vision, the business plan came together. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a brilliant, viable, 50-page document, complete with market analysis, financial projections, and a brand identity that was all Daisy. It was her heart, translated into the language of commerce. But a plan, no matter how brilliant, was just paper. They hit the final, most formidable wall, the money. Not Gabriel's money, but the bank's. The process was a brutal, soul-crushing lesson in the reality of their two worlds. They went to 3 different banks. At each meeting, Daisy would lead the presentation, her voice filled with a passion and a confidence that Gabriel watched with swelling pride. She knew her numbers, she knew her market. She was undeniable. And at each meeting, the loan officer would listen politely, nod, and then turn to the final page of her application, her personal financial statement. They would see her modest teacher's salary, her minimal savings, her student loan debt. Their professional smiles would tighten. The risk, they all concluded, was too great. The rejections were a slow, grinding erosion of her spirit. The chasm between her world and Gabriel's had never felt wider. For him, millions were a rounding error. For her, a 5-figure loan was an insurmountable mountain. Their last hope was a meeting at Sterling National Bank, a larger, more corporate institution. The loan officer, a man named Mr. Davies, was polite but clinical. Daisy gave the presentation of her life, pouring every last ounce of her hope and determination into her words. Davies listened, his face unreadable. He flipped through the pages of her plan, his pen tapping a soft, rhythmic beat on the polished mahogany table. The sound was like a countdown timer on her dream. Finally, he closed the folder. He looked at Daisy, a flicker of professional pity in his eyes. "Ms. Miller," he said, his tone formal and final. "This is an exceptionally well-crafted proposal, truly, one of the best I've seen from a first-time entrepreneur." He paused, and Daisy's heart plummeted. She knew what came after the compliment. "However, the bank's underwriters will see the risk profile as too high. Your lack of collateral, your personal debt-to-income ratio. I'm afraid we won't be able to approve the loan." The words hit her with a physical force. It was over. All the work, all the hope, all the fragile trust she had rebuilt with Gabriel. It was all for nothing. She felt the burn of tears behind her eyes and fought them back, refusing to cry in front of this stranger. She looked at Gabriel, her expression a silent, heartbreaking apology. "We tried." Gabriel saw the light go out in her eyes. He saw her dream dying right there in that cold, sterile conference room. And in that moment, a fierce, protective instinct overrode everything else. He had promised not to use his money, but he had never promised not to use himself. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. "I need to make a phone call." He walked out of the room without another word, leaving Daisy alone with the sympathetic, dismissive loan officer. She assumed he was calling his driver, that this was his quiet, graceful way of ending the charade. 2 minutes later, the phone on Mr. Davies's desk buzzed. He answered it, his tone professionally courteous. "Davies speaking." Daisy watched as the man's face went through a rapid series of transformations. His polite expression shifted to one of confusion, then to wide-eyed shock. His posture straightened. He began to sweat. "Yes, sir," he said into the receiver, his voice now 2 octaves higher. "Yes, I understand completely. Of course. Right away, sir." He hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at the receiver for a long moment, as if it were a venomous snake. Then he turned to Daisy, his eyes full of a new, profound, and terrified respect. "Ms. Miller," he stammered, his professional composure completely shattered. "There's been a reevaluation. Your loan has been approved." The ride down the elevator from the bank's sterile offices was silent and surreal. Daisy clutched the folder containing her approved loan documents, the crisp paper feeling like an impossible artifact from another dimension. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the abrupt, whiplash-inducing reversal. One moment, her dream was dead. The next, it was a reality. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Gabriel was the reason. As soon as they were back in the quiet sanctuary of his car, she turned to him. The cautious truce, the fragile partnership, all of it was suspended, replaced by a single burning question. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice quiet but demanding. There was no anger in her tone, only a desperate need to understand. Gabriel didn't look at her. He stared out the front window, at the city rushing past, his jaw tight. He had known this moment was coming. "I made a call," he said, his voice low. "I know that," she pressed, her patience wearing thin. "Who did you call, Gabriel? What did you do?" She braced herself for the answer she feared, that he had broken his promise, that he had simply transferred the money, turning her dream into just another one of his purchases. He finally turned to face her, his gray eyes serious and unwavering. "I promised I wouldn't use my money," he said softly. "And I didn't. Your loan is from the bank. Your business is your own." "Then how?" He took a deep breath, laying his final secret bare. "I called Arthur Sterling," he said. Daisy's mind blanked. "The chairman of the board at Sterling National Bank?" "He's an old friend of my father's," Gabriel explained. "I didn't ask him to give you the money. I didn't ask him to break any rules. I told him that I had personally reviewed your business plan and that I considered it one of the most promising startups I had ever seen." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "And then I gave him my personal guarantee, not with money, with my word. I told him that if your business were to fail, the hit to my public reputation for backing a losing venture would be far more costly than the loan itself. I wagered my name, my credibility, my entire reputation as a businessman on your success." The sheer magnitude of his action washed over her. He hadn't just opened a door for her. He had placed himself in the doorway, telling the world he would not let it close. He hadn't bought her dream. He had, in the most profound way possible, earned his place in it. He had used the most powerful currency he possessed, not his wealth, but his trust, and he had placed it all on her. It was the ultimate proof, the final, irrefutable piece of evidence that he didn't just love her. He believed in her, completely and without reservation. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of hurt or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming, heart-stopping relief. "Why?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Why would you risk that for me?" He reached across the console, his hand gently covering hers. He looked at her, all the walls, all the secrets, all the fears finally gone, leaving only the raw, beautiful, undeniable truth. "Because," he said, his voice breaking with the depth of his feeling, "a world where you don't get to build your dream is not a world I want to live in." He leaned in, and he kissed her. And in that kiss, there were no more lies, no more tests, no more doubts. There was only the solid, unshakable foundation of a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged, finally, unbreakable. 6 months later, the scent of fresh paint, new books, and brewing coffee filled the air. A cheerful, hand-painted sign swung gently in the evening breeze, its elegant script reading, "The Daily Daisy." It was the grand opening night, and the place was alive. The cafe bookstore was everything Daisy had dreamed of and more. It was warm and inviting, with mismatched armchairs, shelves overflowing with books, and soft, golden light that made everyone look like they were part of a beautiful story. The low hum of happy chatter filled the space as friends, family, former students, and curious locals mingled, sipping lattes and browsing the carefully curated shelves. Daisy moved through the crowd, her heart so full she felt it might burst. This was hers. She had built this. Every book, every chair, every single detail was a piece of her soul made manifest. Her mother was holding court by the pastry counter, beaming with a pride so radiant it seemed to light up the room. Across the way, Chloe was dramatically reading the back cover of a romance novel to a laughing group of friends. And in the center of it all was Gabriel. He wasn't playing the part of the billionaire benefactor. He was simply her partner. He wore a simple black apron over his clothes, a smudge of chocolate on his cheek, and a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face every time he looked at her. He refilled coffee cups, cleared away empty plates, and charmed her old professors, looking more at home here than he ever had in a boardroom. Late in the evening, as the crowd began to thin, the bell above the door jingled. Daisy looked up and saw Mark standing in the doorway. He looked different, less arrogant, more subdued. He took in the bustling, successful scene, his eyes wide with a surprise that bordered on disbelief. He saw Daisy, looking radiant and confident, a universe away from the insecure girl he had once known. He saw Gabriel walk up behind her, placing a gentle, possessive hand on the small of her back, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. Mark's shoulders slumped in a quiet, final defeat. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a concession, an acknowledgement, and then turned and walked back out into the night, a ghost finally laid to rest. By the time the last guest had departed, the clock was nearing midnight. Daisy and Gabriel stood alone in the quiet, beautiful chaos of her dream come true. Empty cups dotted the tables, and books were left slightly askew on the shelves, evidence of a well-loved evening. "We did it," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder, utterly exhausted and happier than she had ever been in her life. Gabriel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. He looked around the room at the tangible result of her passion and his faith. "No," he corrected softly, his lips brushing against her hair. "You did it." He tilted her chin up, his eyes full of a love so deep it felt infinite. "I just got the lucky front row seat." Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Daisy was the heart of her thriving cafe, a beloved fixture in the community. Gabriel, in turn, ran his global empire, but he was a changed man. He delegated more, took more time off, and measured his success not by stock prices, but by the number of evenings he could spend sitting in a comfortable armchair at the Daily Daisy, reading a manuscript while Daisy bustled around, the sound of her laughter the best kind of background music. They were a power couple, yes, but one who found their greatest joy in the quiet, simple moments they had carved out for themselves. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after their first business meeting, he showed up at the cafe just before closing time. "I'm kidnapping you," he announced, a mysterious, playful glint in his eye. "Oh, really?" She laughed, wiping down the counter. "And where are we going?" "It's a surprise." He drove them not to a fancy new restaurant, but back to the Grand Arch Hotel, the place where their entire chaotic story had begun. Daisy felt a jolt of nostalgia as they walked through the opulent lobby. "Finally going to show me how a real billionaire lives?" she teased, squeezing his hand. He smiled but didn't answer. He led her into the private elevator, but instead of going down to the ballroom, he pressed the button for the penthouse suite. When the doors opened, she gasped. The suite was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panorama of the city. But Gabriel hadn't filled it with champagne or roses or any of the typical trappings of luxury. In the center of the vast living room sat a single, small table. On it were 2 steaming mugs of coffee from her cafe and a messy, beloved pile of well-worn paperbacks. Daisy turned to him, her eyes questioning. "This is my world now, Daisy," he said, his voice soft and full of a profound sincerity. "My world is wherever you are." He took her hands in his gaze intense and full of a love that still, after all this time, made her breath catch. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by contracts, negotiations, and agreements," he began, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Clauses and bottom lines. But I've learned that the only deal that truly matters is the one I hope to make with you." And then he slowly, deliberately, got down on one knee. The powerful, confident, brilliant man who commanded boardrooms and shaped the literary world was kneeling before her. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside, nestled against the dark fabric, was a ring. It wasn't a massive, ostentatious diamond. It was a simple, elegant sapphire, the exact color of the evening sky, flanked by 2 small, sparkling diamonds. It was perfect. It was her. "I never believed in fate until I met you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You walked up to me, a complete stranger, and you changed my entire world with a single, desperate kiss. Daisy Miller, you are the best, most unexpected chapter of my life." He looked up at her, his heart, his hope, his entire future in his eyes. "Will you be my partner, my love, and my favorite story for all the chapters to come? Will you marry me?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Daisy's face, blurring the glittering city lights into a soft, beautiful watercolor. She was laughing and crying all at once, a sound of pure, unrestrained happiness. "Yes," she breathed, the word full of all the love and relief and certainty in her heart. "Of course, yes." Gabriel's face broke into a smile so radiant it outshone the entire city skyline. He slid the sapphire ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. It felt like a final, beautiful piece of her soul clicking into place. He stood, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her, a deep, loving kiss that held the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings and a lifetime of shared stories. They had come full circle, ending their story in the very place it had begun, not with a lie, but with the most profound truth. 1 year later, the bell above the door of the Daily Daisy jingled. The cafe was humming with its usual afternoon energy. Daisy, now visibly pregnant, was laughing with a customer as she handed them a latte. Her life was full, and it was real, and it was everything she had ever wanted. Gabriel sat at his usual corner table, a manuscript in his hands, but he wasn't reading. He was just watching his wife, a soft, adoring smile on his face. He had found that in a world full of grand, epic tales, his favorite story was the simple, everyday one he was living. She caught his eye from across the room, and her smile widened. A secret, intimate message passing between them that no one else could understand. He got up and walked behind the counter, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting a hand on her growing belly. He nuzzled his face into her hair, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of coffee, old books, and her. "You know," he whispered, his voice a low, happy rumble against her ear. "After all this time, I still think that was the best kiss I never saw coming." Daisy leaned back against him, her heart full and steady. She turned her head, her lips brushing against his cheek. "And to think," she murmured, a playful, happy light dancing in her eyes. "All I wanted was to get away from my ex." She turned fully in his arms and gave him a soft, lingering kiss. "I guess," she whispered against his lips, "I just ended up running to the right place." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms in the heart of the beautiful world they had built together. A perfect unwritten epilogue, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most chaotic, unexpected beginnings lead to the very best happily ever afters.